Well, friends, welcome to this special webinar, which is more of an in-house webinar. When we are talking about all that's happening in the history of Palestine, we need to understand some of the issues behind this struggle, events that have happened. And so here is the Indo-Palestine Solidarity Network, which is a network of individuals drawn from different traditions and different religious groups and ideologies. We all come together with a commitment for justice, for human rights, and we are against apartheid and all sorts of discrimination. And in a very special way, we are looking at what's happening to the Palestinians. As Ranjan has already indicated, that we've got quite an international ecumenical group with us this evening. So welcome to all of them. A special welcome to the Palestine Solidarity Network from Sri Lanka. And our focus this evening is on NAKBA. Now, as I said, it's an in-house learning experience. There are different terms that we often come across when certain incidents happen. One term that many of us are familiar with is the term Holocaust. And the Holocaust brings to us memories of the destruction and slaughter on a mass scale, particularly of the Jews at the time of their persecution. But Holocaust refers to destruction and slaughter on a mass scale of any people and for any reason. There's another term that is often used. It's called pogrom. And pogrom is again an organized massacre of a particular ethnic group or a particular group which is identified by being a caste group or of a different color or whatever. And therefore here again, it's an organized massacre. We also have this term genocide. And this again brings in the connotation of a deliberate, systematic destruction of a group of people. They are being destroyed because of their ethnicity or their nationality or their religion or race. It is in this context of the terms Holocaust, pogrom, genocide that we are looking at this word NAKBA. And NAKBA denotes catastrophe. And in the context of the Palestinian history, NAKBA Day is Yom an-Nakba, the day of the catastrophe. And it commemorates the catastrophe that the Palestinians have experienced, particularly in 1948. And this day of commemoration has been set aside to be 15th May every year. The catastrophe that we are talking of, particularly of 1948, it is said that in the 1948 war, an estimated 750 Palestinians fled or were expelled, and hundreds of Palestinian towns and villages were depopulated and destroyed. And these refugees, as they struggled for survival, they went to different places, whether it was in Jordan or in Lebanon or in Syria or the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. And so we are talking about NAKBA, the catastrophe. Just to get a historical background, we will be watching a film afterwards, which will highlight the catastrophe. But just to get a historical background, let us be reminded that way back in 63 BCE, we have the incorporation of Palestine into the Roman Empire. And it was in the Christian era, 70, that the second temple of the Jews in Jerusalem was destroyed. And so the Jews were no more there, they were scattered, and Palestine was then a province of the Roman Empire. From 661, the Palestinian region came under the Umayyad caliphs, who ruled over Palestine from Damascus. From 750 up to 1258, the Palestinian region came under the Abbasid caliphs. And then from 1516 right up to 1917, Palestine was incorporated into the Ottoman Empire with its capital in Istanbul. Now, this is a long period, 1516 to 1917. It is during this period that the Palestinians, as they became a province of the Ottoman Empire, developed a sense of their identity. And they were proud of their Arab heritage and ancestry. And they considered themselves to be descended not only from the Arab conquerors of the 7th century, but also from indigenous peoples who had lived in the country since time immemorial. Politically, their loyalty was to Constantinople, partly because the Ottoman Sultan was also Caliph and head of the Muslim community, and partly because they felt like citizens rather than subjects of the empire. So there was this sense of identity of Palestinians developing during this period. But during this period, 16th century onwards to the early 20th century, there was another thing happening. And that was the impact of the Enlightenment in Europe, particularly in the 18th and 19th century. This gave rise to the Jewish Enlightenment movement. This was called Haskalah. In 1791, the French Revolution led France to become the first country in Europe to grant Jews legal equality. And remember, it was the time of Napoleon. And Napoleon, in fact, in 1799, issued a proclamation offering Palestine as a homeland to Jews under France's protection. Well, his idea was to establish a French presence in the region, but his vision of a Jewish state for the people did not materialize in his time. But as I said, Europe was giving recognition to the Jews. France was the first. Britain gave Jews equal rights in 1856. To recognize the Jews as citizens of the different countries they were part of. But at the same time, there was another movement happening. The formation of modern nations in Europe led to prejudices against Jews. And so this whole term called racial anti-Semitism came into being. And these anti-Semites saw Jews as an alien religious, national, and racial group. And therefore, they actively tried to prevent Jews from acquiring equal rights and citizenship. It was in this context, it was in this context that there was a move among the Jews to settle in Palestine. In 1862, Moses Hess, a former associate of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, wrote Rome and Jerusalem, the last national question. And he called for the Jews to create a socialist state in Palestine as a means of settling the Jewish question. And then we see the first modern Zionist agricultural settlement taking place around 10 kilometers east of Tel Aviv. There were pogroms happening in the period, as a result of which, again, there was a person called Judah Leib Pinsker. He published a pamphlet called Auto-Emancipation, Self-Emancipation, arguing that Jews could only be truly free in their own country, and analyzing the persistent tendency of Europeans to regard Jews as aliens. He said, since the Jew is nowhere at home, nowhere regarded as a native, he remains an alien everywhere. And therefore, they should get their place in Palestine. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Okay. In 1882, we see the beginning of the first wave of 25,000 Zionist immigrants entering Palestine, coming mainly from Eastern Europe. And so you see the influx beginning. In 1890, there was the Society for the Support of Jewish Farmers and Artisans in Syria and Eretz Israel. And this was an officially registered charitable organization in the Russian Empire. Then you notice in 1896, Jewish Colonization Association in London, which started aiding Zionist settlements in Palestine. And then the first Zionist Congress was called in 1897 in Switzerland, which issued the Basel Program, calling for the establishment of a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It also established the World Zionist Organization to work to that end. So what we notice is the influx of immigrants coming with support of the European countries. 1904, the second wave of Zionist immigrants starts, and 40,000 Zionist immigrants enter Palestine. 1914, we have the beginning of the First World War. And immediately following the declaration of the war on the Ottoman Empire in November 1914, the British War Cabinet began to consider the future of Palestine. And a Zionist cabinet member, Herbert Samuel, proposed the formation of support for Zionist ambitions. On 16th May 1914, Sykes and Picot Agreement was secretly signed, dividing Arab provinces of Ottoman Empire between Britain and France. And so these secret arrangements also started to take place. In 1917, November, we have the Balfour Declaration, where the British Secretary of State, Arthur Balfour, he pledged British support for a Jewish national home in Palestine. We notice that towards the end of the First World War, in 1918, Palestine was occupied by the Allied forces in September. 1919, the third wave of Zionist immigrants came in, 35,000 of them entering Palestine. It was in 1919 that the first Palestinian National Congress in Jerusalem sent a memorandum to the Paris Peace Conference, rejecting the Balfour Declaration and demanding independence. When the Palestinian National Congress wanted to meet again in May, the British government prohibited them from meeting. In 1921, March, there was the founding of the Haganah, the Zionist illegal underground military organization. And therefore, here was an army being prepared right there in Palestine. The Palestinians, the National Congress, they kept on opposing the Balfour Declaration, but nobody was willing to listen to them. And what happens in 1922, the League of Nations Council approves the mandate for Palestine. And as a result of that, British mandate for Palestine came into force in 1923. In 1924, we have the fourth wave of Zionist immigrants, 67,000 of them entering into Palestine. And then a fifth wave in 1929 of 250,000 Zionist immigrants coming in. There were several attempts made by the Palestinians to oppose this, but there was no one listening to them. The Arab Higher Committee, which was formed, rejected the Royal Commission's proposal about the formation of a Jewish state under the Commonwealth. Nobody listened to them. The Arab National Congress in Syria had 450 delegates, and they also rejected the partition proposal of the British, and they wanted a stop to Zionist immigration and prohibition of transfer of Palestinian lands to Zionist ownership. What was the response? The British government dissolved the Higher Arab Committee, and all Palestinian political organizations. And so we see the beginning of the Second World War. And at the beginning of the Second World War, we have another wave of 60,000 Zionist immigrants coming in. And in 1945, we have a large-scale illegal Jewish immigration into Palestine. So all this was happening, and as a result of which, you can see preparations being made to conquer Palestine on the part of the Jews. And so there was this military organization called Haganah, and Haganah was being supported by IZL and Stern Gang. These were paramilitary forces that were there employed by the British government. So all these three groups joined hands together in trying to start the attack on the Palestinians. And you find that Haganah gets weapons, orders weapons from Czechoslovakia and other places, and the consignment comes in. When this was happening, the Arab League organized the Arab Liberation Army, ALA, a voluntary force of Arab irregulars to fight the onslaught that the Jews were planning. And as it happens, in 1948, the arms arrive and the Haganah, along with the other paramilitary forces, move, plan, tell it into action. And as a result of which, we have the massacre beginning. And as we said, that this was a terrible massacre in which 750,000 Palestinian Arabs had to flee or they were expelled. And as you look at history then, this catastrophe, of course, did not end in 1948, though, of course, 1948 was that critical time of the catastrophe. In 1967, we have the Six-Day War, which again brought in its catastrophe. We find the Palestinians struggling for their rights under Yasser Arafat from 1969 onwards. We have the Palestinian Liberation Organization led by him. And of course, the PLO got recognition from the Arab League. And in 1974, Yasser Arafat was the first non-state leader to address the United Nations General Assembly. So there were these attempts made by the Palestinians to get recognition. In 1978, there was an attempt to bridge peace. And we find that the leaders then tried to get peace done. It was Rabin and Yasser Arafat at Camp David. However, the peace deal did not last and problems have continued. And as the problems continued, the Palestinians realized we have to rise up. And the rising up of the Palestinians is called the Intifada. And there had been uprisings, but along with the uprisings, the catastrophe keeps on having different manifestations. The Israelites set up barriers, and these barriers have now turned into walls, the walls all around Jerusalem, and many strictures being imposed on them. And the whole focus is to deprive the Palestinians of their land, to deprive the Palestinians of their livelihood, and to finish off the life of the Palestinians. So it is in this context that we are going to look at this film on the Nakba, the catastrophe that the Palestinians have experienced and continue to experience in different forms. We will now look at the film. Ranjan?
We will start the film now and would request all of you to stop the videos, please, so that you. This is the history in 42 minutes.
1948. For Palestinians, that year is a NAKBA, or the catastrophe. When hundreds of thousands were forced out of their homes. For Israelis, that year marks the creation of the State of Israel. As a filmmaker and as a Palestinian, this documentary series was my way to understand the events of the past that are still shaping the present.
Our story starts here in 1799, outside the walls of Acre in Ottoman-controlled Palestine.
Ranjan can't see the video.
Under Napoleon Bonaparte, besieged the city. All part of a campaign to defeat the Ottomans and establish a French presence.
Can you see the video?
No,
Yes, it's visible.
Okay.
I can't see him
Then, John, there must be a problem with your connection.
outside.
In search of allies, Napoleon issued a letter offering Palestine as a homeland to the Jews under French protection. He called on the Jews to rise up against what he called their oppressors. Napoleon's appeal was widely publicized, but he was ultimately defeated. In Acre today, the only memory of him is a statue atop a hill overlooking the city. Yet Napoleon's project for a Jewish homeland in the region under a colonial protectorate did not die. 40 years later, the plan was revived by the British, this time as a means of thwarting the rising power of Egyptian governor Muhammad Ali. In 1840, British Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston wrote to his ambassador in Constantinople, urging him to convince the Sultan and his entourage to open Palestine for the immigration of Jews. At that time, there were estimated to be no more than 3,000 Jews in Ottoman-controlled Palestine. Over the years, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased, helped on by wealthy benefactors. One of these was the French aristocrat Baron Edmond de Rothschild. He began visiting Palestine in the 1880s and became one of the Jewish community's leading sponsors. He spent over 14 million French francs to establish 30 Jewish settlements. The most important was Rishon-LeZion, founded in 1882. Today, the remains of Baron de Rothschild lie in a mausoleum in northern Israel. It's a popular site for Israeli schoolchildren, learning about the wealthy patron who bankrolled Jewish settlement building in Palestine over 100 years ago. In 1885, the term Zionism was first coined by Austrian writer Nathan Birnbaum. It's derived from the word Zion, one of the biblical names for Jerusalem. Zionism came to mean the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but not all Jews supported this.
طبعا كان في طائفة يهودية في البلاد تحت الحكم العثماني، بس هذا ما كانوا صهاينة، هم كانوا يهود محليين. أما اليهود اللي أجوا من أوروبا، خصوصا من شرق أوروبا هذيك الوقت في أواخر القرن 19 كان بدهم يبنوا يهودي جديد.
In 1896, Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian journalist, wrote a book called The Jewish State. It is considered one of the most important texts of early Zionism. Herzl envisioned the founding of a future independent Jewish state during the 20th century. His colleague, Max Nordau, sent 2 rabbis to Palestine to investigate the prospects for a Jewish state there. Their report concluded, "The bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man." The rabbis understood that Palestine's spouse was the Palestinian society rooted in its soil. 1997, Herzl with Birnbaum and Nordau convened the first Zionist Congress in the Swiss city of Basel. The Congress adopted a program for the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine.
إنما هرتزل بدأ يدعو رسميا وعلنا لإقامة هذا الكيان، وثانيا اتصال بدول العالم الكبرى آنذاك في أوروبا بشكل خاص حتى تحمي واحدة منها تحمي هذا الكيان. فهرتزل هو أبو الدولة الصهيونية ما في شك، لكنه ليس مبدع الفكر الصهيوني، هو معقد مؤتمر لهذه الدول معا واتفقت الدول على دعمه. هو كان يثير التنافس بين دولة وأخرى، كان يكذب على دولة أنه أنا سأكون معكم إذا أسستم دولة إسرائيل ضد الدول الأخرى، أنا أؤمن مصالحكم على حساب مصالح الدول الأخرى.
In 1907, the British government set up a committee to devise a strategy toward the Muslim Arab population of the Ottoman Empire. The committee's report, submitted to British Prime Minister Henry Campbell Bannerman in 1907, recommended establishing a so-called buffer state in Palestine. The report proposed this state be hostile to its neighbours and friendly to Europe. The aim was to divide the region and so assure Britain's continued imperial dominance.
بحيث أن هذا الجسم يكون معتمد على الاستعمار الغربي ويعتمد على الأوروبيين. هذا الجسم ضمان بقائه أن يكون ما حوله ضعيفا.
في كمان فكر عند الأوروبيين إنه اليهود مقربين لهم أكثر من العرب، وإذا تكون هون دولة يهودية بيكون أفضل لهم.
In 1907, Chaim Weizmann, a chemist who had emerged as a leader among British Zionists, visited Palestine for the first time. He set out to establish a company in Jaffa to develop the land of Palestine, a practical means to pursue the Zionist dream of building a Jewish state. His venture was supported by Baron de Rothschild. Within 3 years, a major deal was struck. The Jewish National Fund, set up to buy land in Palestine, purchased some 10,000 dunams in the Marj bin Amma region of northern Palestine. The sale to the Jewish National Fund had dire consequences for the thousands of Palestinian farmers living on the land.
أكثر من 60,000 فلسطيني في منطقة مرج بن عامر. إذا كانت النكبة تعني ترحيل الإنسان الفلسطيني من أرضه والاستيلاء على أرضه في القوة ضمن هذول المركبين، حقيقة النكبة بدأت عشرات السنين قبل 48.
A more drastic form of colonialism than the average classical European colonialism, in the sense that their purpose was actually not so much only to exploit the locals, but to drive them out.
From the very early moment, the Zionist movement targeted Palestine as the place for Jewish independence and statehood. And it was clear that there were Palestinians on the land. Zionist leaders and the common people alike were got used to the idea that the only way of making Palestine a Jewish state is by causing the Palestinians to leave.
إخلاء الفلاحين هو تطبيق المبدئين، من ناحية الاستيلاء على الأرض تسمى تهويد الأرض، وثانيا العمل العبري وهو الاستعاضة عن فلاحين عرب بيهود إما من شرق أوروبا، وفي حالات أخرى عندما قل العدد استعانوا بيهود من اليمن.
A Jewish militia known as Hashomer was established to protect the growing number of Jewish settlements. Jews held demonstrations to demand the recognition of Hebrew as an official language under Ottoman rule.
العربي والفلسطيني كان واعي من اليوم الأول لمفهوم الصهيونية. هي حركة عنصرية تبحث عن رأس مال لاستعمار أرض وتوظيف البعد الديني لجعلها وطن لمن تبقى من يهود العالم في هوية وكيان ومستقبل سياسي. هذا الوعي كان واضح جدا عند نجيب عزوري، كان واضح جدا عند نجيب نصار.
In 1908, Najib Nassar, a Palestinian pharmacist, began publishing a newspaper called Al-Carmel. In it, he warned of Zionism as a movement aimed at displacing the Palestinians. He wrote, "The Jewish state would be a poisonous dagger in the heart of the Arabs." The outbreak of World War I in 1914 created new opportunities to reshape the Middle East.
خلال الحرب البريطانية كان يفكروا عن الموقع، يعني فلسطين على قرب من قناة السويس ودور بريطانيا في مصر آنذاك، كان يدل على دور خاص لبريطانيا في فلسطين، ورأوا في اليهود وفي الحركة الصهيونية شريك في أمر استراتيجي استعماري.
In 1915, a secret memorandum was presented to the British cabinet under the title The Future of Palestine. It was drafted by Herbert Samuel, a British politician and Zionist committed to Palestine becoming a home for the Jewish people. In the document, Samuel advised that the time was not ripe for the establishment of an autonomous Jewish state in Palestine. He recommended instead that Palestine be annexed to the British Empire, describing this as the most welcome solution to the supporters of the Zionist movement. He expressed the hope that under British rule and over time, more Jews would settle in the land and grow into a majority among what he called the Mohammedans of Arab race. Samuel's recommendations were taken into account in the secret British-French agreement formulated by British politician Sir Mark Sykes and French diplomat François-Georges Picot. The Sykes-Picot agreement opened the way for the establishment of a Jewish state. In 1917, the British cabinet, headed by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, pledged to establish a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. The pledge came in the form of a letter from the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to the influential British Zionist Lord Walter Rothschild.
بالفور كان يمثل الحكومة البريطانية، ولما كتب رسالته إلى لورد روثشايلد كان يكتب باسم الحكومة البريطانية. روثشايلد كان يلعب دور شخصي اللوبي ليشجع الحكومة البريطانية أن تأخذ سياسة معينة بالنسبة إلى دور اليهود في فلسطين. كان يمثل الحركة الصهيونية، ووراء كلهم خايم فايزمان اللي كان المسؤول بالنسبة للورلد زاينست اورجانيزيشن أو المنظمة الدولية الصهيونية.
اللي شارك في صياغة الوعد يعني.
نعم.
Britain had no moral or political or legal right to promise the land that belonged to the Arabs to another people. So the Balfour Declaration was both immoral and illegal.
A month after Balfour's pledge, a meeting took place in London to celebrate the declaration. Speakers included Lord Rothschild, Herbert Samuel, Mark Sykes, and Chaim Weizmann. Just several days later, on December the 11th, 1917, the British Army, commanded by General Edmund Allenby, captured Jerusalem. Entering the Holy City alongside Allenby was a Jewish military unit, established under British auspices. One member of this unit was David Ben-Gurion, who would later be Israel's first prime minister. The unit also included Ze'ev Jabotinsky, a future Zionist leader, as well as Nehemiah Rabin, soon to be father of young boy Yitzhak Rabin. Within a month, General Allenby welcomed Chaim Weizmann in Jerusalem. There were approximately 50,000 Jews in Palestine at this time, 10% of the population, among 500,000 Arabs. The Great War ended in 1918, and preparations were made for a peace conference in Paris. President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, commissioned an investigation into the non-Turkish areas of the former Ottoman Empire. The commission was headed by the academic Dr. Henry King and a politician, Charles Crane. When it was eventually published, the Crane-King report proved to be political dynamite. The report stated that the non-Jewish population of Palestine, nearly 9/10 of the whole, was emphatically against the Zionist program. The report went on to warn that anti-Zionist feeling in Palestine and Syria was intense and not likely to be flouted. It divulged conversations with British officers, suggested a force of not less than 50,000 soldiers would be required to initiate the Zionist program. The authors judged all this as evidence of what they described as a strong sense of the injustice of the Zionist program. The report concluded Jewish immigration should be definitely limited, and the project for making Palestine distinctly a Jewish commonwealth should be given up. The Crane-King report fell on deaf ears. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Britain was represented by Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Arthur Balfour. A delegation from the Zionist organization attended, headed by Chaim Weizmann. They presented a map, seen here, proposing the area to be allocated to a Jewish homeland. The map included both Palestine and the east bank of the Jordan River, as well as parts of what are today southern Lebanon and Syria. Parallel to the conference, the leader of the Arab delegation, Prince Faisal bin Hussein, signed with the Zionist allegations leader what became known as the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement. It outlined Faisal's approval for a Jewish homeland in Palestine and an Arab nation in the larger Middle East. The agreement was mediated by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Edward Lawrence, known as Lawrence Arabia. Faisal signed, adding in his own handwriting that the agreement be dependent on the Arabs gaining their independence.
الحركة الصهيونية من 1919 تقريبا فهموا إنه التركيز على السياسة الخارجية ما بكفي. يعني المفروض لنا علاقات كثير كويسة في لندن، في لنا مكتب في نيويورك وواشنطن، ولنا ناس في برلين وفي باريس والى آخره. بس إحنا فيهم ناس وإحنا لازم أو نتفق معهم، بس نيجي لإشي معهم لازم ناخذهم بعين الاعتبار على الأقل. و1919 أسسوا مركز استخبار للحركة الصهيونية 1919 وكانوا ناس يعني أنا ذكرت إنه كان في علاقات في كثير مناطق علاقات منيحة بين اليهود والعرب. كان في يهود كانوا جيل ثاني هون، يعني إذا جاء لهون في 84 1884 86 هم انخلقوا هون ولدوا هون وكانوا يحكوا عربي ويركبوا الفرسان ويروحوا عند العرب، كان عندهم أصحاب عرب وصاروا يلموا معلومات من نوع واحد، معلومات سياسية. شو الرأي العام؟ هل بدهم يوافقوا على المشروع الصهيوني أو لا؟ وين في أراضي فاضية؟ وين في ناس ممكن يبيعوا أراضي لليهود؟ الثاني حكي الثالث نقول كان إذا في خطة لمهاجمة يهود بمنطقة معينة، يكون واحد يقول لك يعني جماعة قعدوا عندنا وحكوا بكرة بدنا نروح عن مستوطنة معينة يروح يحكي لأصحابه اليهود.
In 1920, the first British High Commissioner for Palestine was appointed. Controversially, London selected Herbert Samuel for the post. Samuel was a committed Zionist. Many suspected he would set out to implement what he had proposed 5 years earlier, by favoring Jewish immigration to transform Palestine into a Jewish homeland. In 1922, the League of Nations formalized British rule in Palestine. The second clause of the British Mandate document, approved by the League of Nations, stipulated, British mandatory shall be responsible for placing the country under political, administrative and economic conditions that will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home. British High Commissioner Herbert Samuel decreed Hebrew as an official language of Palestine alongside Arabic and English. The letters E and Y were added to the word Palestine in Hebrew as an abbreviation of the words Eretz Yisrael, meaning land of Israel.
هربرت سامويل تحت إشراف الانتداب البريطاني هو الذي خلق إسرائيل قانونا، وضع القوانين حوالي 100 قانون لكي يمكن تسريب الأراضي العربية إلى يد اليهود. ثانيا سمح لليهود بأن يكون لهم نظام تعليم منفصل عن نظام حكومة فلسطين. وأهم ما عمله الإنجليز أن سمحوا لهم بأن يكون لهم جيش منفصل. أنا أتكلم عن 1920.
Britain provided the muscle under which they could simply emigrate. I mean, they couldn't have immigrated were it not for the British presence. Because the crucial battle in the early stages was simply getting Jews into Palestine and acquiring land. They couldn't have done that without British government's sponsorship.
الانتداب البريطاني أخذ أهم شيء البشاع والمتروكة والمملوكة للحاكم ملكها للحركة الصهيونية في المستوطنات فورا.
السلطة البريطانية كانت تعطي منح أراضي لليهود حتى يسوي كوكوسات وشغلات هاي، واحنا نشوف الاشياء مش ما نشوفها، لكن من واحد يعني انا في جيل كذا.
وحموا الوكالة اليهودية التي كانت شبه حكومة في أيام الانتداب، وأعطوها كل المساعدات العسكرية والمادية وساعدوا على إخفاء نفسها. فهي مهارة صهيونية مؤامرة بريطانية، وإلى حد ما آسف أن أقول غباء أو بساطة عربية فلسطينية.
Palestinians viewed the British mandatory authority and British troops on the ground as siding with the Jews. more and more Palestinian farmers, expelled from farmlands, began to join newly formed revolutionary groups. In 1921, Palestinians organized large demonstrations against Jewish immigration. At that time, the Palestinian leadership was in effect hereditary, within one family. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, inherited his position at the age of 25, following the death of his brother, who had in turn succeeded their father. The leadership sent successive delegations to London to discuss the Palestinian question.
الحركة الوطنية الفلسطينية بشكل واضح كانت تعمل على أن تجمع الصيف والشتاء تحت سقف واحد، الحفاظ على صداقة بريطانيا في جانب ومعاداة الحركة الصهيونية في جانب آخر، وهذا لا يمكن أن يستقيم.
نخبة دقيقة جدا، رقيقة جدا بالعدد يعني وبالتالي تقابل نخبة إمبراطوريات، يعني اليهود في بداية القرن العشرين نخب إمبراطوريات فعلا يعني.
تقريبا في كل منطقة وكل لقاء للمؤسسات الفلسطينية اللي أسست هذيك الفترة مثلا اللجنة المسيحية المسلمية وكل المؤسسات والمجلس الإسلامي الأعلى والهيئة الإسلامية كل المؤسسات بعد كم من ساعة من الجلسة كان في تقرير لليهود هيك وهيك حكوا هذا رأيه هيك وهذا ممكن تشتغلوا معه هذا عدو لكم وهذا ممكن تشتروه بالمال وإلى آخره والتقارير يعني موجودة بالأرشيف الصهيوني.
The changes on the ground in Palestine can be noted in the British government's report to the Council of the League of Nations in 1925. The document reported the immigration of more than 33,000 Jews who were granted Palestinian nationality. This was 3 times the figure of the previous year. 13 new settlements were built according to the report. A Jewish labor union called the Histadrut had been set up under the direction of David Ben-Gurion, and the Jewish town of Tel Aviv was accorded municipal autonomy. In addition, the Hebrew University was officially opened in 1925 at a ceremony attended by British High Commissioner Herbert Samuel, the former British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, and the head of the Zionist organization, Chaim Weizmann. As Weizmann's guest, Balfour visited a number of Jewish settlements. In Jerusalem, he met with Samuel and Allenby, the 2 men who had helped implement the policy he himself had laid out 8 years earlier in the famous Balfour Declaration. The Palestinians went on strike to protest against Balfour's visit. They raised black flags to signal their opposition to the policies Balfour had set in train. The Palestinians were in somber mood. Not so the Zionists.
الصورة المشهورة بتلاقي سيدة بالخليل حاطة 3 حجابات، سيدة في القدس حاطة حجاب واحد معظم وجهها مبين تحت الحجاب، والوطنية المسيحية فيش حجاب. وماشيين مع بعض وراحوا على بيت المندوب السامي واحتجوا واعترضوا.
Weizmann congratulated Samuel for his work towards the establishment of a national Jewish homeland. The Zionist movement was active in its propaganda. This film, in French, showed the map of Palestine with areas highlighted as land the Zionists claimed to have acquired as of 1925. The film also shows the areas Zionists planned to acquire within the next 25 years. In the summer of 1929, ardent Zionist groups organized a gathering at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, known to the Palestinians as Al-Burak. The incident ignited violent demonstrations called the Burak Revolt, led by a Palestinian farmer named Farhan al-Sadi. More than 100 Arabs and Jews were killed on both sides. Sir John Chancellor, the new British High Commissioner in Palestine, issued a strongly worded memorandum calling for all those who took part in the revolt to be severely punished. 3 Palestinians were arrested and accused of participating in the revolt. They were Fuad Hassan Hijazi from Safad, Atta Ahmed Al-Zair from Hebron, and Mohammed Khalil Jamjoum, whose picture could not be found. The 3 men were jailed here at Acre Prison. The British sentenced them to death. Arab delegations pleaded for their sentences to be commuted. But on June 17, 1930, the British authorities had the 3 men executed. A cemetery in Acre still contains the graves of the 3 men. In a final statement before their execution, they had written, "At the end of our lives, we say to the Arab leaders and Muslims all over the world, do not trust the foreigners. We lived and died for the Arab cause." Such sentiments of anti-colonialism and pan-Arabism would become increasingly common in subsequent decades. During the first 10 years of the British Mandate, the number of Jews in Palestine more than doubled to reach 175,000. Zionists all over the world were proud of their achievement.
I am here today to ask you, my fellow Zionists, which attitude shall we take? Which of the possible attitudes that we face shall be our own? I would say to England, though I am only an American Jew, but an all-time reverence and admirer of Great Britain, I would say to England, if I could, an Arab Palestine is a threat to Great Britain and a menace to the world. A Jewish Palestine is an asset to Great Britain and a blessing to the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, the toast is health and long life to the Right Honourable Lloyd George.
With Chaim Weizmann beside him, former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George reaffirmed his own Zionist credentials.
It is, as your chairman has reminded you, it is nearly 16 years since he recruited me to the Zionist movement. Palestine, barren and malarial swamp, have been converted into happy settlement. Science has been harnessed. Water, which had been running wild and waste since the early days of creation. Without vegetation and without life, empty desolation, that is Palestine.
British news bulletins at the time described Palestine as akin to a desert. The reality was very different.
الزرع ومعونة الله معونة الله إنه ما كنت تعرف تمشي فيه. هيك الزرع الخضرة تصير فيها تطلع الصبح تروحي على المكساة تهدى ريحة الخضرة تفحفح نوار على الخيار نوار على الفقوس هالبندورة حبي كيف هذا الشيء بتذكرها 100% إن الدنيا ما كانت عيدها.
بالنسبة لي طبرية أجمل مدينة بل أجمل مكان في العالم. المسيح لم يقم في مدينة طبرية، إنما أقام حول مدينة فيها عمل معظم معجزاته على مياه مشهد.
British politicians of the early 20th century had a distorted view of Palestinian society, frequently labeling it as Mohammedan, despite the population including over 100,000 Palestinian Christians.
They did not regard them as yet belonging to either an Arab national group in general or to local national groups. The only way they were able to view them was as a religious group of believers. So I think they missed the point, for instance, that Christians and Muslims actually founded a new identity, not a religious one, but a national one.
حالة المسيحيين الشرقيين غير موجودة. هنالك مأزق لدى الاستعمار عندما يستخدم التيولوجيا المسيحية في الرؤية المنطقة والشرق الأوسط اللي أدت إلى تبني الصهيونية فيما بعد. مأزق في التعامل مع المسيحية الشرقية. يعني هذه تشكل مش موجودة في عالمه. ولذلك يحاول أنه ينكر وجودها أصلا. يعني لأنه مجرد وجودها بتربك كل الصورة.
By 1933, protests against Jewish immigration were becoming ever more frequent in Palestine. Women took part side by side with men. The British authorities cracked down on demonstrations and arrested thousands. Many were killed and wounded. Musa Kazim al-Husseini, the 80-year-old former mayor of Jerusalem, was beaten by British soldiers during a demonstration in Jaffa. He later died of his injuries. The British authorities became ever more heavy-handed. This letter was written by a Palestinian policeman condemning the behavior of his British senior officer, John Faraday. A number of other complaints were filed against Faraday. The officer was never charged. 4 years later, Faraday was awarded the King's Police Medal for his valuable services in Palestine.
عدم رغبة بريطانيا بمنح المطالب الوطنية للشعب الفلسطيني وعدم رؤيتها للشعب الفلسطيني كمجموعة قومية وطنية ذات حقوق ومعاملتها على أساس إنها طوائف أدى في حين عاملت الوكالة اليهودية على أساس أنها ممثلة لمجموعة قومية. كل هذا مجتمعا أدى إلى تفاقم الوضع والصدام مع بريطانيا.
Only still images of the Palestinian demonstrations are available in the archives. Movie cameras did capture Jewish life in Palestine, as well as British pomp and ceremony. This footage shows the Star of David flag over the Tel Aviv municipality building. This is footage of work in the diamond factories of Tel Aviv. And this footage shows the flow of new immigrants and the building of new settlements. Footage of Palestinian life in the early 20th century proved more difficult to find. A Palestinian film archive had once existed, but had since been lost or gone mysteriously missing. We spent months searching for pictures of Palestinian lives. Eventually, in the vaults of the British Library, we found glimpses of this bygone era.
Most of the Palestinians, intellectuals, leaders, journalists, were still unaware how determined the Zionist movement is of dispossessing them of Palestine.
In the 1930s, the number of Jews immigrating to Palestine began to increase significantly. From 4,000 in 1931, the figure jumped to 9,500 the following year. In 1933, the number rose to 30,000. In 1934, 42,000. And in 1935, a further jump to 62,000. That same year, Palestinian poet Abdul Rahim Mahmoud wrote a poem which he read aloud to Prince Saud bin Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia, who was visiting Jerusalem. He asked, "Did you come to visit the Holy Aqsa Mosque, or to bid it farewell before it is lost?"
هذه الأراضي عم بتروح، الوعد عم ينفذ، غياب أي تفاعل معها من الحكم البريطاني في قمع وفي بطش وفي قوانين رهيبة في الحكم البريطاني لحد اليوم إسرائيل عم بتطبقها في الاعتقالات وفي الإبعاد وفي البطش. يتحرك من 35 عز الدين القسام.
عندما أرسل القسام للقيادة الفلسطينية في القدس ليستشيرهم في الثورة قالوا أنه نحن الوقت غير مناسب لإعلان ثورة، الشعب غير ناضج لإعلان الثورة، وقالوا أيضا أننا ما زلنا نحن نراهن على إمكانية الحصول على حقوقنا من خلال المفاوضات السياسية.
Sheikh Ez ad-Din al-Qassam established a revolutionary group to strike at Zionist and British targets. In 1935, in the hills near Jenin, he and a small band of men were surrounded by British forces. Making a defiant stand, al-Qassam and those with him were killed.
حركة القسام لم تحظى بالاهتمام الكثير من جانب المؤرخين، ولا نعرف عنها الكثير بسبب الغموض التي اكتنفها وبسبب الحرص الشديد للشيخ عز الدين القسام على سرية العمل وعدم إطلاع الكثيرين إلا الصفوة الصغيرة من طلابه.
امتدت روح عز الدين القسام في الوسط الفلسطيني،
وتأثر بها كثير من الفلسطينيين، فبدأت مشاعر الانقلاب أو التمرد على الاستعمار البريطاني تظهر في صفوف الشعب الفلسطيني.
The Palestinian political leadership came under pressure to halt negotiations with the British. Palestinian poet Ibrahim Toukan addressed a poem to the leadership in 1935, a poem dripping with irony. Oh, you sincere patriots, you who carry the heavy burden of the cause, only a fragment of the country remains for us, so please step down before the remaining parts fly away. On April the 19th, 1936, Palestinian anger boiled over. Protests erupted in the city of Jaffa in coordination with a general strike. The wave of anger spread throughout Palestine. The reasons for the protests were explained by a spokesman for the Palestinian political leadership.
The main case of the Arabs is against the British government's policy in Palestine. A policy which, if continued, will surely have as a result the replacement of the Arabs by the Jews. Against all principles, the British government imposed the Balfour Declaration, which is abhorred by all Arabs in the Near East, and on favoring the establishment of a national home for Jews, forgot intentionally to safeguard the civil rights of the non-Jewish population. The Arabs, who decided on a general and a complete strike until the total and immediate stoppage of Jewish emigration is brought about, and until the government introduces an essential change in its present policy.
لأن صار الإضراب اللي هو من أعظم الإضرابات في التاريخ، إضراب 36، كل فلسطين أضربت، وهذه جاءت نتيجة النضالات اللي صارت في مواجهة الانتداب، حكم الانتداب وتحيز الانتداب مع اليهود وتمكينهم من تسهيل الأمور عليهم في كل شيء.
The 1936 revolt shocked the British mandatory authorities, who carried out harsh punitive actions. Anyone suspected of links with the revolutionaries was arrested, their homes destroyed. In Jaffa alone, more than 200 houses were demolished as a collective punishment. Demolitions in other villages and cities followed. The British insisted that destroying Palestinian houses was justified as a means to end the revolt.
شو بتتذكر عن الإنجليز؟
الإنجليز حطوا مخيع، حطوا مين؟ حطوا المركز بل هذا على الطريق. مين ما فات خالي إله، خالي ماخذ الصغيري تبعه، فاهمين؟ قالوا له فوت أنت والصغير تبعك بدك تقنص المركز. قالوا أنا ماخذ صغيرتي. ضربوا، لما ضربوه؟ ضربوا لريمون، اسمه ريمون الضابط. لما قتلوا مات. أخذناه عملوا عملية على حيفا في مستشفى حمزة، فاهم؟ قريب بهذا لهذا. لا قالوا من الضرب هون منديل الشحم رايح دايم. مات. لهلبونا.
شو يعملوا؟
ايه يقتلوا الاسلام ويأخذوهم على السجن على تركيا، على شرشور هذا البلد، ولا شرشور هذا عند بنيامين هذه. يحبسوهم هناك شهر شهرين ويشغلوهم في المحاجر. شغال الشقة ويجيبوهم هون على نور شمس على المحاجر. شغال الشقة.
إذا بتقري مذكرات بن غوريون كان يتحدى المفاوض العربي في قمة الثورة، في قمة ال36، في جلساته مع موسى العلمي اللي رتبها وكهو المندوب السامي. قال له احنا إلنا حضور فعلي، لا يستطيع الغربي ببريطانيا أن تقول لنا لا، من أنتم في بريطانيا.
During the Arab revolt, David Ben-Gurion, then a prominent leader of the Zionist movement, reportedly made a startling suggestion to the British High Commissioner, Arthur Warhol. Ben-Gurion is said to have suggested all Palestinians expelled from their land by Jewish settlement building should be resettled in neighboring Transjordan. The British High Commissioner is reported to have replied that this was, in his words, a good idea.
Over to you, Roger.
Oh. Friends, we've gone through this documentary, and perhaps some of you may have some questions. We would like, if you would like, we would bring in a Palestinian next time to further articulate this NAKBA experience in the lives of the people. And if any one of you would like to have a copy of this video as well as of other visuals, please send us your request and we shall try to make those available to you. We shall also try to add you to our list, and you can always look up the IPSN and Palestinian updates so that you could be continuously updated on all that's happening. The NAKBA isn't finished, it is continuing. So all those who would like to have the visuals and even the manuscript, we will try to make it available to you. At this time, we shall request Sister Zita to say a few words on the way forward and to say thanks.
Dear friends, we have come to the end of a very informative webinar on the NAKBA, the occupation of the land belonging to Palestine by the State of Israel. Thank you, Roger, for your very clear history of Palestine. It took a lot of trouble to get from way back 600 BC until the present time. The film that followed made the history even more clear. Thanks for that presentation. Let me quote Martin Luther King. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Some of you may be familiar with the sad and unjust part of the history of the people of Palestine who inhabited the land since 600 BC. For others, it may be either new or known to some extent. Whatever our knowledge of the NAKBA, the reality is that it not just happened in 1948 and before that, but that the illegal occupation continues today with more land belonging to the Palestinians being taken away, almost on a daily basis against international law. The even sadder reality is that the international community looks on without challenging the might of Israel. Some countries may raise feeble voices in protest, with the UN declaring the infringement of international laws and agreements. But once things have died down, it's business as usual. The international community could apply sanctions, as was done in the case of South Africa, which led to the end of apartheid system and equality and freedom for Black South Africans. But today, the self-interest of nations trumps over justice, with the Arab countries now, who were once staunch supporters of Palestine, now making peace deals with Israel. Each deal a stab in the back of the Palestinians. Where do we, ordinary world citizens, come in? How can we support the people of Palestine when it looks as if we really cannot counteract Israel and its powerful allies, especially the USA? While the truth is that we cannot do anything major that is going to change the status quo overnight, we can share our widow's mite to this cause. At the present time, when the clouds could not be darker than it is for the Palestinians, our support is very vital for them. They need to know that they are not alone in their just struggles, and that millions of citizens around the world are supporting them in their resistance to the ongoing occupation of their lands. We can show our support in different ways. By supporting hundreds of groups on Facebook that are with them. These groups are both Palestinian groups as well as international groups. Our own Indo-Palestine Solidarity Network has recently started a Facebook page which posts events in Palestine many times a week. This would be the case of other groups, international, national, as well as Palestinian groups, and even Jewish groups who support what is happening, who support what is the bad treatment of Palestine today. One of these groups is the well-known Jewish Voice for Peace. B'Tselem is a Palestinian group. There are other groups like Christian Peacemakers Team, Global Kairos, Palestine Updates, Defense for Children International, No Way to Treat a Child, Adamir for Political Prisoners in Israeli Jails, International Solidarity Movement, the Ecumenical Advocacy for Palestine and Israel. Almost every country has its own group in solidarity with the Palestinians. So when we are browsing Facebook, remember Palestine and like it and support the groups and share what we feel the world needs to know. We also have a Twitter account initiated recently by our youngest teenage member, Shabika Fatima. You're invited to follow this Twitter account. We can also write or sign campaign letters to our own Indian government, which has made a sad turnaround supporting colonial Israel, when since independence, India has supported the just cause of freedom and equality for Palestine after our own struggle against the colonial British rule. Today, India has made big trade deals with Israel for different areas of our so-called development. And we are the second largest buyer of Israeli military equipment. Most of Israel's military equipment has been field tested on Palestinians. So my dear friends, let us, after this webinar, keep Palestine in our list of to-dos, remembering the words of Nelson Mandela. As long as Palestine is unfree, we are not free. And before the partition of Palestine, Mahatma Gandhi said, Palestine belongs to the Arabs in the same sense that England belongs to the English or France to the French. It is wrong and inhuman to impose the Jews on the Arabs. Surely it would be a crime against humanity to reduce the proud Arabs so that Palestine can be restored to the Jews partly or wholly as their national home. Thank you to each of you for your presence and participation in this webinar. In our present situation, when there are countless webinars taking place on the internet, we are happy that you chose to come and participate for this one. We hope this session has moved you enough to stand up and make a difference. If you are interested in participating in future webinars or in signing campaigns to free Palestine, put your email ID in the chat box or send us a line to our email ID, Indo-Palestine Solidarity Network @gmail.com. Once again, thanks to each of you. A very special thanks to Roger and to Ranjan and Roselle for the video that they shared with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Zita, for very apt concluding remarks, as well as concrete suggestions that you've made of how we could be active, proactive in solidarity with the people of Palestine. And once again, thanks to all for having joined us. And we are so happy that you're with us in this cause. And we look forward to your ongoing participation with us. We are noting the email IDs that are being sent to us on the chat box. And we will do our best to keep you informed. And most welcome to all our future webinars, as well as the other actions that we would propose that we do together for the cause of the land, the livelihood, and the life, the dignity of the Palestinians. Thank you and good night.